Hi, my name is Sarah Farisa with the Manchester number of 307933, and I will be presenting first. So, what is our scenario about? So, the whole spectrum of our scenario is all about maritime and also cyber attack, but mostly mainly about cyber attacks. So, the scenario that we pick talks about state A and state B, where state A launches an attack, a cyber attacks to be correctly, cyber attacks during ships belonging to state B because of the two states rising political tensions. With the number of heavy consequences that state B has experienced, state B decides to bring this case, the cyber attacks towards them, to court. But in court, State A claims that the incident was just a cyber operation without direct physical force. What in this case, physical force is all about military attacks, physical attacks. To defend themselves, State B argues that the consequences that they have experienced are just on par with physical force, so cyber attacks should also qualify as an armed attack under international law. So I will move on to the introduction. So with the rapid and swift innovations of technology these days, technology has caused maritime to be dependent on technologies to especially ensure their security. So technology aid in maritime can include GPS systems, their navigation systems, and many more. So, with the technology and the maritime interconnection system are just interconnected, this allows for those who are having bad intentions to attack these to as an opportunity for them to either attack or do some unlawful consequences. Therefore, these maritimes are in risk to overcome, not to overcome, to experience a severe consequences. But this actually raises the question on how international laws should actually classify and respond to cyber attacks that also produces physical destruction and harm. When people see cyber attacks in the older days, it's not strong enough to be considered as harm when its consequences is also as harsh as physical attacks. So this is actually can question on how international law actually should classify and respond to these cyber attacks. So moving on, during the situation there was two uh, frameworks that was given. So firstly is traditional views and secondly is effects-based views. So I will just explain briefly on these two frameworks and the specifications will be explained by my friends later. So firstly, traditional views claims that only attacks involving direct physical military force qualify as a use of force or an armed attack under international law. So what attack would you think? Attacks like military official attacks, bombing, and even cannons and many more. As long as it is physically, the type of attack is physically. Even gunshots are considered uh, as a use of force. So in this situation, state A's attacks towards state B would not qualify as an armed attack since no traditional military force was used. Essentially, cyber attacks, example like drones, hacking, is not considered as a physical as a use of force or even an armed attack. In the other hand, effects-based views argues that the legal classification of the attack should depend on the consequences of the attack rather than the method used. So basically, rather than focusing on the method used to attack, effects-based views argues that the consequences should be considered more rather than the method used. So basically, this framework defends that cyber operations should be treated as an armed attack, not regardless of whether physical weapons was used. So that is all for the introduction. I will move on to the next presenter.
Now, I will explain regarding the framework A, which is the traditional view and how it is applied to the section B. So basically, the traditional view is a legal approach that interprets the concept of use of force under international law in a narrow ways. According to these frameworks, only actions involving physical military force such as bombings, missile attacks, military invasions, or armed attack by soldier can be classified as an use of force or an armed attack. So under this view, cyber operations are generally not considered as an armed attack because they do not involve with the conventional weapons or direct physical military actions. So therefore, a cyber attack is usually treated as a cyber interference, sabotage, or unlawful activity rather than armed attack. Next, we move to the legal basis. First, the traditional view is mainly based on the Article 2x4 and Article 51 of the United Nations Charters. So, Article 2x4 prohibits states from using force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state. So, traditionally, the terms force refer to physical military force. So, meanwhile, the Article 51 recognizes a state's inherent right of a self-defense if an armed attack happens. So, this interpretation is also supported by the decisions of the International Court of Justice (ICJs), especially the Nicaragua versus United States case and the oil platform case. So, in these cases, the court emphasized that armed attack generally involved with serious military force and physical violence. So now we move to the strengths of these frameworks. So the first strength is legal certainty and predictability. So states clearly understand when the right to self-defense can be used because of the threshold is limited to the physical military attacks. This reduces the confusions and help maintain consistency in international law. So the second strength reflects the existing of state practice. So many countries still hesitate to classify cyber attack as an armed attack. So therefore, the traditional view aligns with the current cautious approach taken by many states. So the third strength is preventing the unnecessary escalations. So basically, the cyber attacks are often difficult to trace because of the attackers can hide their identities using proxy servers and other techniques. By requiring evidence of physical force, these frameworks reduce the risk of false accusations and unnecessary military responses, helping to maintain the international peace and security. Despite its strengths, the traditional view has several weaknesses. First, it is often considered as an outdated in the digital age. So modern cyber attacks can cause serious physical damage, injuries, and economic losses without using traditional weapons. Second, it creates an accountability gap. States may conduct harmful cyber operations while avoiding responsibility because those actions do not meet the traditional definitions of an armed attack. Third, it struggles to address the reality of modern cyber warfare. Significant cyber incidents can disrupt critical infrastructures such as transportation, healthcare, and energy systems, yet may not qualify as an armed attack under this framework. As a result, many scholars argue that the traditional view does not adequately address the challenges of 21st century of warfare. Overall, the traditional view provides a clear legal standards, supports legal stability, and helps prevent unnecessary conflicts. However, its strict focus on physical military force makes it less effective in addressing the growing threats posed by the cyber warfare. As technology continues to evolve, the suitability of this framework remains an important debate in international law.
Hi everyone, I'm Vaishnavi Kanapati and I'll continue on 3.0, which is Framework B. When analyzing this legal problem, I focus on a core question: Should international law only care about the type of weapon a state use, or should it focus on the actual damage and human suffering left behind? Continue on with 3.1, which is legal basis. To establish the legal basis for Framework B, my analysis centers on a modern purpose-driven reading of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which bans countries from using force against one another. Now, we must acknowledge that when the Charter was drafted back in 1945, the writers were only thinking about the traditional military attacks because cyber warfare simply didn't exist. However, I argue that the ultimate goal of the UN Charter is to maintain international peace and security. If we ignore modern tech-based attacks, we create a massive gap in legal protection. Under the effectiveness principle, this framework argues that if a cyber operation causes real-world destructions, injuries, or death, it must be treated as a use of force. This directly aligns with the Taliban Manual 2.0, where top international law experts agree that the scale and effect based on operation are what truly matter. We are also seeing world governments move toward this view, especially following the widespread condemnation of massive real-world incidents like the 2017 North Korea cyber attacks. Moving on with 3.2, which is strengths. When evaluating this model, I identified two major strengths that make this effect-based view incredibly strong for today's world. First, it deals with modern reality. Today, aggressive states can achieve major military goals using just keyboard instead of traditional missiles. Framework B ensures that the law stays relevant. Second, it closes the legal loophole and ensures fair accountability. Under the traditional view, a country could theoretically paralyze an enemy's hospitals, transport, or energy grids and completely escape legal trouble by claiming it was just a digital operations. If we apply this reliably to our paper, which says that state A's cyber attack caused navigation system to fail, a physical collisions between vessels and real injuries to human crew members. My analysis focused heavily on this actual harm, ensuring that victims are protected and that digital violence is treated with the exact same gravity as physically military strike. Next, moving on to the 3.3, which is the weakness. To be completely transparent and professional in my defense, I must also highlight the real practical weakness of this framework. The first weakness is that there's no clear, globally accepted threshold. Because cyber operations are so diverse, nations and legal experts still furiously debate exactly how much digital disruption or economic damage is required before a cyber operation officially counts as a use of force. The second and the most difficult issue is attribution. In cyberspace, attackers easily hide their identities using proxy services and complicated routing software. If an affected state cannot prove with high certainty that a specific government-directed attack, this reacting with military force in self-defense become highly controversial and could accidentally spark an unneeded war. Lastly, because this framework is interactively evolving, it has not yet fully solidified into universal customary international law. Ultimately, my position is that despite the tough challenges surrounding cyber attribution, looking at the effect is the most ethically sound way to protect human lives and stable societies today. To show how this strength and weakness balance out side by side, I will now hand the floor over to the next presenter who will present our evaluation criteria. That's all from me. Thank you.
So let's moving on to 4.0 into the comparative analysis. We will begin with the first criterion, which is legality. So the central legal question in scenarios B is whether State A cyber attack on State B ships constitute a use of force under Article 2/4 of the United Nations Charter, and both frameworks offer competing interpretation of this provision, although they differ tremendously in their legal soundness when applied to the scenario. So let's start with the traditional view. It holds that use of force refers strictly to physical force as a provide under Article 2/4. Under this reading, State A's argument that the strike was only a cyber operation. It does carry some textual weight since no conventional weapon, troops, or military units were deployed against State B's. So proponents of this view argue that maintaining strict threshold is necessary, because without them, international law risks expanding beyond what states have formally consented to. And Schmidt in 2017 acknowledged this position. So on the surface, there is a degree of legal logic here. However, there is a serious flaw in this reasoning, and that is that it forgets the effect of the attack entirely. In scenario B, the cyber attack caused two ships to collide at sea, resulting in actual physical injury. That harm, in its material effect, bears no meaningful difference from what conventional force produces. So by focusing purely on the method and ignoring the outcome, the traditional view ends up contradicting its own protective purpose. And it is exactly this flaw that the next slide addresses. This is precisely the fault that the effect-based view addresses. Rather than focusing on the instrument use, it applies Article 2/4 according to its own purpose, which is to prevent acts that threaten international peace and security by any means. So the focus shifts from method to outcome. Under this framework, if a cyber operation causes effects that functionally resemble those of a conventional military attack, including physical damage, injury, and death, it should be treated as a use of force under international law. And Schmidt affirms this in 2017 in his article itself. Applied to scenario B, this position is even more defensible because the harm is not theoretical, it is real and measurable, and this is where the direct contrast between the two frameworks becomes more apparent. The traditional view favors form over substance, while the effect-based view prioritizes outcome. When the harm produced by both conventional and cyber means is identical, prioritizing outcome is simply the more legally coherent position. Because if the international law extends protection only to physical injury caused conventionally, while allowing identical harm inflicted digitally to go unaddressed, it ceases to make legal sense. On the criterion of legality, therefore, the effect-based view is the stronger position. Having established that, we now turn to the second criterion, which is how each framework holds up against existing and developing international law. Okay, on to this next slide. On the question of consistency with international law, both views, again, differ significantly in their persuasiveness, though the picture here is more nuanced. The traditional view does carry institutional weight at this level. It draws on established ICJ jurisprudence in Nicaragua versus United States from 1986. The court interpreted armed attack as grave use of force, typically associated with military action. And in the oil platform case from 2003, the court similarly stressed that the requirements of Article 51 are only fulfilled through the existence of an actual physical attack. These are significantly rulings, and they lend real legal authority to the traditional view. However, the critical limitation is that neither of these judgments consider of implication of technological development. That is not a minor gap. It means that these precedents, as alternative as they are, were never designed to address scenario like scenario B, and that significantly limits how applicable they are to modern cyber conflict. In that sense, the traditional view is less aligned with the technological realities of today's world. And with that limitation in mind, we can now look at how the effect-based view fares on the same criterion. The effect-based view, by contrast, reflects the pathway towards the advancement of international law. It draws on evolving state practice and opinion juries, both of which are recognized source of customary international law under Article 38 of the ICJ statute, meaning they carry general legal weight and cannot be dismissed as merely political. A strong illustration of this is that the 2017 NotPEA cyber attack, which paralyzed critical systems globally. Multiple states, including the United States and several European members, condemned it as posing a risk to international order. As Johannes Meyer notes in 2025, this reflects a growing consensus among states that severe cyber conduct constitutes an act of aggression. That kind of consensus matters legally because it signals formation of customary international law through state practice and opinion juries. And then we also have Telling Manual 2.0, which hold that the magnitude of consequence of a cyber operation are what determine whether it constitutes an act of aggression. While the manual is non-binding, it represents the considered opinion of leading international law experts, and it significantly strengthens the legal underpinning of the effect-based view. And on this criterion too, the effect-based view is the more persuasive framework. Now, let's step back to look at the overall picture, directly comparing both frameworks across these two criteria. The traditional view is anchored to historical precedents that predate cyber warfare entirely and does not account for the actual measurable harm demonstrated in scenario B. The effect-based view, on the other hand, is grounded in evolving state practice in expert consensus and a purposive reading of the UN Charter that better reflects the realities of modern conflict. On both legality and consistency with international law, the effect-based view is the stronger framework. That said, it is important to note that legal and doctrinal strength is only one side of the picture, so the ability to resolve real disputes and whether a framework thus leads to fair outcomes remain key considerations, which the broader analysis will continue to address. Thank you.
So moving on to practical enforceability, the traditional view is generally easier to apply in practice because it provides a clear legal threshold. Under this approach, a use of force only exists when there is actual physical military force. This gives states greater legal certainty and makes it easier to determine when the right of self-defense under Article 59 of the UN Charter can be invoked. Another advantage is that it reduces the risk of false accusation and unnecessary military escalation. This is especially important in cyberspace, which is where identifying the source of an attack is often difficult because attackers can hide their identity through proxy servers, malware, and third-party networks. However, the traditional view has also significant limitation, which is modern cyber operation can cause serious physical harm without using conventional weapons. In scenario B, the cyber attack caused two ships to collide and injured sailors. Despite these real-world consequences, the traditional view may not classify the incident as a use of force because the attack was carried out digitally. This creates a legal gap where states suffering serious cyber harm may have limited legal. In contrast, the effect-based view is more practical for addressing modern cyber threats because it focuses on the consequences of the attack rather than the method used. Under this approach, a cyber operation that causes physical damage, injuries, or major disruption can be considered a use of force. In scenario B, the collision of the ships and the injuries suffered by the sailors are comparable to the effects of the conventional military strike, making the effects-based view is more suitable. Nevertheless, this approach also faces practical challenges. The biggest issue is attribution. Even when serious damage occurs, it may be difficult to prove that a particular state was responsible for the cyber attack. Without clear evidence, any response by the victim state would could become legally controversial and politically risky. Overall, while the traditional view provides greater legal certainty and easier enforcement, the effect-based view offers a more realistic response to a modern cyber warfare. In scenario B, the key challenge is not only determining whether the cyber attack constitutes a use of force, but also proving that State A was responsible before State B can lawfully respond. For ethical implication, the traditional view raises concerns about justice and fairness for the victims of cyber attacks. This approach focuses on the methods used in the attack rather than the actual harm that occurs. As a result, victims may not receive the same legal protections if the attack is carried out through cyberspace instead of conventional military means. In scenario B, the cyber attacks caused two ships to collide and injured several sailors. Even though the victims suffered real physical harm, the traditional view may not classify the incident as a use of force because no missiles or conventional weapons were used. So, from an ethical perspective, this can be seen as unfair to the victims. On the other hand, the effect-based view is considered more ethically persuasive because it focuses on the consequences of the attack. Under this approach, attacks that produce similar levels of harm are treated equally, regardless of whether the damage was caused by a missile or a cyber operation. Since the sailors in scenario B suffered physical injuries similar to those caused by traditional military attacks, the effect-based view provides a fairer outcomes for the victim. In addition, this approach is more consistent with the humanitarian objective of international law, which aim to protect individuals, maintain peace, and prevent unnecessary suffering. However, the effect-based view also has challenges, which is cyber attacks are often difficult to attribute, and states may wrongly accuse others without sufficient evidence. This could lead to injustice and further conflicts. Overall, the effect-based view is generally more ethically sound because it focuses on the actual harm experienced by victims. In scenario B, it would be difficult to morally justify treating the cyber attacks differently from a conventional military attacks when both resulted in similar physical injuries and damage.
Thank you, Aisha, for the presentation. Finally, let's move on to the final justification. After deliberate discussions and considerations while Willis doing the report, we think we have decided that effects-based views is the better framework due to its persuasiveness and legal sustainable work framework to address cyber operations. Yes, traditional views offers a degree of legal certainty and restraint, but it fails to cover and respond appropriately to the realities of modern cyber conflict. Traditional view is good for physical attacks, but it doesn't cover much more on cyber. As with the world moving so fast with good innovatives and more, we think that traditional views doesn't cover all that. In the in the in the meantime, effects-based views has a solid foundation into shifting the focus of real consequences of attack rather than the technical means and methods through how it is carried out. Effects-based use, we think, actually covers on cyber attacks more because it does not uh, care on the method rather than they consider more on the consequences of the attack. So it is effects-based views is also more consistent with the purpose and objectives of the United Nations Charter. We also think that the effects-based views aligns more closely to the developing practice of states and the modern legal frameworks. Effects-based views does actually align more to the transformation and the development of the modern world nowadays, and we think it is more valid with the situation now. Traditional view we think traditional view is less convincing because it focuses too heavily on the method of the attack rather than the actual harm used. Not physical attacks. Yes, it does give a great consequences, but with the modern innovatives of the world nowadays, even cyber attacks can be as severe the consequences being on par with the physical attacks. So in this year, we think in this scenario, the cyber operation carried out by state A should be treated as an armed attack because the consequences are just as comparable with those of a traditional conventional physical attack.